All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the next installment in the webinar series, Unpacking PREA, the North Carolina approach to victim services behind bars. Today's webinar is focused on understanding trauma and how to provide trauma-informed care. Next slide, please. My name is Gabriella Nyman, the Training and Communications Specialist with NC CASA, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. Next slide. Before we start our webinar, here's some basic information about NC CASA. We are an inclusive statewide alliance working to end sexual violence through education, advocacy, and legislation. We use a social justice framework, therefore, our work is done from a strong intersectional social justice perspective. By centering our work around marginalized communities, everyone is served. Some of our work includes the Training Institute, including our online learning module, supporting rape crisis centers, resource sharing and technical assistance, legislative and policy work, anti-human trafficking outreach, prevention education, working with colleges and universities, and providing access to language services. Next slide, please. Before we begin, I want to go over some webinar logistics. We are using Zoom for the webinar series. I will explain a few things about this platform in case you are not familiar with it. All participants are muted throughout. Please enter any discussion responses in the chat box at the bottom of your screen as shown in the slide. We will have time for questions at the end, but feel free to ask them at any time. You can submit a question in the Q&A button, and I will be keeping an eye on them throughout. The webinar will be recorded. A recording will be posted on the NC CASA website in the coming days, along with the resources mentioned in this webinar. If you have trouble with Zoom, please email me at gabriella@nccasa.org. This webinar is one in a series that aims to replicate regional in-person trainings NC CASA was hosting throughout North Carolina. While we like meeting people in person, we are excited to offer the training in this way. Today, our presenters will focus on trauma and what is meant by trauma-informed services. We encourage you to join us for the other webinars in this series. You can register for them on NC CASA's website. After today's webinar, we will have 2 more webinars in June. We will then have 3 webinars on Tuesdays in July to finish out this series. You can register for all webinars and view the recordings on the NC CASA website. More specifically, today's webinar will focus on trauma and the impact traumatic events have on the brain, including the short-term response and the long-term impacts. There is no one way that someone will react to a traumatic event. Therefore, it is important for correction staffs to recognize signs of trauma and how to manage them, utilizing a trauma-informed approach to care. I would like to introduce Tara Graham, she, her, hers, Senior Program Director at Just Detention International. Tara spent nearly 14 years working on the development and implementation of the PREA standards. Lisa Cook, she, her, hers, jail consultant for NC CASA. Lisa is the former Buncombe County Jail PREA coordinator and was a DOJ certified PREA auditor. In her work with NC CASA, she assists in creating trainings in partnership with NC CASA and other agencies. She is the co-author of the North Carolina Approach, Creating and Navigating New Relationships to Better Serve Incarcerated Survivors of Sexual Assault, a resource we will introduce in the webinar series. I will now hand the webinar over to Tara.
Thank you, Gabriella. It's a pleasure to be here today and to continue a collaboration with NC CASA. Just Detention International, or JDI, is the organization presenting this webinar today. And before I get into the webinar itself, I would like to tell you a bit more about JDI. We are a health and human rights organization that seeks to end sexual violence in all forms of detention, including adult prisons and jails, juvenile facilities, lockups, community confinement settings, and immigration detention. We do this by working with corrections officials and allied professionals to end sexual abuse in detention. by educating the public and allied professionals about sexual abuse in detention, and by supporting survivors of this form of abuse. We believe that no one deserves to be raped, no matter what crime they may have committed. It is our mission to work to end this public health crisis and to make sure people are safe. During this webinar, we're going to be sharing some quotes and stories from survivors of sexual abuse in confinement. Some of these are graphic and may be difficult to hear or upsetting. We will also be talking about trauma. Given recent world events, including COVID-19 and protests of police violence, it has been a challenging few months, weeks, and even days. Please take care of yourselves. Take deep breaths or step out as needed. And since this webinar is recorded, you can always come back to the NC CASA website to revisit it later if necessary. We are taking time to talk about trauma and how it shows up in corrections facilities, because the people in custody and care are survivors of trauma. In women's facilities, we know that 85 to 90% of prisoners are survivors of sexual abuse, intimate partner violence, or trafficking before they even get to confinement. When you understand trauma and what it looks like, you are better able to prevent, detect, and respond to sexual abuse and harassment in correctional facilities. If you were able to join us for the PREA 101 webinar, you will recall that we shared statistics about rates of sexual victimization. What we know is that 1 in 3 women, 1 in 6 men, and half of transgender people are survivors of sexual abuse in the community. The numbers are higher for people of color, people with disabilities, and people with mental illnesses. Trauma has lifelong effects on people that sometimes makes it more likely that they will end up being incarcerated. So, when you hear the phrase trauma-informed, know that it refers to taking universal precautions. When you make changes in policies and practices, when you respond to a crisis, when you interact with anyone in the facility, staff and inmates alike, think about how trauma is showing up and how understanding trauma should shift your approach. We will now watch a video of survivors of sexual abuse in confinement. Please note that they will speak about the sexual abuse they experienced. They will also speak about the trauma histories that so many in confinement have experienced over the course of their lives. I want to thank them in advance for sharing their stories, many of whom are part of JDI's Survivor Council for their willing and who are advised on the work that we do. So give me just a moment as I do a new share here and bring up this video.
I was a 20-year-old scared to death child. I had spent 8 hours in a car with 2 officers transporting me from the county jail that I was in Northern California and was driven down to Southern California. It was the last 8 hours of my life. Within the first month of my being on the yard, I was actually sold by my roommate to another girl down the hall in a poker game. I later was attacked by 2 women and held down and raped. I thought I was alone. Only much later did I realize that I was 1 in 200,000 people who are sexually abused in detention every single year. So many of them fall through the cracks, just like me. Before I was adopted by a military family, I spent the first 7 years of my life in an orphanage. After I served my 29 years, I never thought I'd go back to prison, but today I am. I work at Just Detention International, and our mission is to end sexual abuse in detention and to make sure that prisoners get the help they need while they serve time.
I was 12 years old when I first entered juvenile hall. I was sexually abused by fellow inmates. Staff members were aware of this abuse, and they turned their heads, and they didn't want anything to do with me or the abuse. That led to future destruction in my life. So I ended up in adult prisons being abused and being attacked, not only by fellow inmates, by staff members as well. So it really turned my life upside down.
In the year 2006, I was arrested for public drunkenness and ended up at LA County Jail. This cop made a comment. He said that we all walk like girls. And I said to the person next to me, a man unsure of his masculinity. And obviously the cop heard, he rushed me, pinned me up against the wall, threatened me. A few days later, the same man that threatened me actually came into my cell. And of course, he came in there and manhandled me, threw me on the ground, stripped me naked, assaulted me sexually. Total humiliation.
We as inmates or convicts, we're not allowed to show emotions, but we're full of emotions. We just can't show them. A lot of times there's this thing where we feel we're going to get rejected, we're not going to be accepted, we're not going to be worthy of help.
Hi! So good to see you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm so good. And you?
I'm good. Coming back in to try to help your sisters that are left behind. It doesn't get any better than that.
And I agree.
I feel that it's my duty, my absolute duty as a warden that believes in rehabilitation, that once a woman comes to me for whatever length of time that she's here, to try and help her get better, because I want her to take advantage of whatever I have here in this prison and then go out and parole and not come back again. And even if she happens to have a life sentence, she still can get better while she's here, because this then becomes her home. This becomes her community.
My name is Bo, and I was here for 29 years.
So JDI has helped us in so many ways. And the difference with JDI is that they come in and they go the next step. It's not just assistance, it's training, education that ends up changing the culture of the institution.
I lived on a unit of 120 people. This was my cell. There was 119 other broken women who coped with their issues their way. I don't know of any woman in the 29 years that I did here that hadn't been abused in some sort of way. We're bringing this in so that we can be better, so that when I walk out of these gates and I have a trigger, something that I remember from the past that may have made me melt down any other time, I have a toolbox now. I have, I've talked this through. I've worked through this. I have someone I can call. I know that I'm okay. Shocking enough, we didn't know. We had rights, and Just Detention International brought those rights to us.
These lockup shows and stories about what we do in prison. And I think the more people watch those things, the less human I become. I am a human, and I made a mistake. And sometimes we didn't make mistakes, but we end up in prison. And yes, we have to do things to survive in there. But we are individuals who need help.
I've had people tell me, you don't look like a lifer. And I'm not sure what a lifer looks like. They have the same problems everybody else has. It's just in a lot more of a confined space, which for us makes it even scarier. And to know that there's a light at the end of the tunnel means everything. And that's what an advocate can give.
Tomorrow is back to work. Tomorrow is Just Detention International, Wilshire Boulevard. Get more packets out to survivors. It's back to try and help the ones that I didn't get to see today.
Great. So special thanks to Bo, Frank, Troy, and Martin for sharing of their stories. And I now want to just kind of keep
Broadcast
going.
is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good day, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar.
Just a moment. I apologize. I apologize about that. I didn't know that was going to come up after that video, so I apologize. I just want to quickly talk about the word trauma. It means wound in Greek, and in ancient times it was used only to refer to physical harm or damage, but now it also includes emotional hurt as well. This is an image of Joe Booth, a JDI Survivor Council member, when he was speaking before the National Commission on Correctional Healthcare, or NCCHC, at its 2013 conference in Denver, Colorado. And he spoke about, yes?
Stop your screen share so the audience can't see what slide you're on.
Oh, I'm sorry. Let me see if I can fix that. Just a moment. Let me go back. Okay, hopefully now you can see my screen, and let me go back to the slide. I apologize about that. Are you able to see my screen now, Gabriella?
Yes.
Excellent, thank you for that. So again, Joe was speaking about his experience about being sexually assaulted in prison and the help he received from a rape crisis advocate when he was taken to the hospital for a forensic exam. And now that we've heard from a few survivors about their experiences, I want you to think about the people you serve in your role working in corrections or as victim advocates. And if you could take a moment to put your responses in the chat box, what are some examples of traumatic events? And Gabrielle, when you have a moment, would you, after we've gotten a few in, would you mind reading those aloud?
Yeah, I can do that.
So again, if you can share in your chat box, examples of traumatic events.
So, car accident, rape, loss of a loved one, polyvictimization, childhood rapes, adult rapes, divorce.
Great, thank you for those. Right, like all of those count as examples of trauma. And there are so many things that can cause trauma. And this slide just gives an example of some different things. But first, let's define a traumatic event or experience. It is one where there is a threat or a terror and a feeling of being out of control. And you cannot know exactly how out of control it will make someone feel. Over time, chronic stressors can accumulate to cause trauma. Many people experience multiple traumatic experiences over a lifespan. While the immediate focus might be on a recent event, the individual's reaction is affected by earlier experiences. The recent protests around police violence stem in part from the racism and historical trauma that Black members of our society have faced for generations. The hallmark of a traumatic event is a threat plus a lack of control. It is a life-altering event that can be marked in time. This was me before, this is me after. Healing is bringing those two together. I cannot help but to think of how the time we are in now of COVID-19 and the trauma that people have experienced and will continue to experience as a result of the pandemic, to say nothing of the long-term impact this will have on individuals and communities for generations to come. The last NC CASA in-person training comes to mind for me. It was the mark in time of before the pandemic and then my life after. The last training was held as the world and the US were starting to shut down. I recall those of us at the training were constantly getting updates on our phone about changes minute by minute. And by the time I returned home, my daughter's school had closed, and by that weekend, stay-at-home orders were in place. Each survivor may have a version of what this all looks like that is unique to them. During the event, their focus was on survival and coping, and we can't predict what a particular survivor's focus might have been or how that will manifest in the aftermath. As this slide reads, trauma reactions are a set of normal responses to an abnormal amount of stress. I think it is important to keep this statement in mind when looking at individuals who are acting in response to trauma. Also keep in mind that trauma can have both short and long-term effects, and the impact may not be immediately recognized. It can affect an individual's coping response or ability to engage in relationships, or it can interfere with a mastery of developmental tasks. And it may affect an individual's psychological responses, physiological responses, psychological well-being, social relationships, and/or spiritual beliefs. And while trauma at any point in a person's life will affect the person, there are some factors that may increase the overall impact of the trauma. The younger the age when trauma occurs, the more likely the consequences, even if the individual has no memory of the trauma. Core features of the trauma experience for many people are shame and humiliation. These emotions can be devastating and impede healing. One of the most important messages you can give a trauma survivor is that no matter what happened, it's not their fault. Sometimes trauma survivors are intimidated by their perpetrator into not telling what happened. Other times, when they do try to talk about what happened to them, they are ignored or not believed. One of the most important things you can do for a trauma survivor is to give them a chance to tell their story. Healing starts when a person's personal experience is heard and validated. The impact of trauma is magnified when the perpetrator is a trusted figure, a relative, religious leader, coach, teacher, or therapist. This kind of trauma is often called betrayal trauma because the sense of betrayal can be profound. Complex trauma, meaning the difference between someone who has experienced a one-time or short-term traumatic experience that has a lifelong impact as opposed to someone who has experienced repeated abuse or long-term traumatic experiences. There is a difference in the impact of their life, which can lead to a shift in their view of the world as dangerous and bad or unpredictable and unsafe. It can shift their sense of self, identity with and internalizing about the abuser, made to feel inherently bad or worthless and incapable, and also a shift in their belief system, leading to a loss of faith, view of authority, family, or community as cruel, and an existential crisis and loss of hope. Furthermore, someone who has experienced complex trauma may have difficulty regulating affective impulses such as anger and self-destructiveness, dissociative episodes, chronic sense of guilt or responsibility, difficulty trusting people and or feeling intimate, hopelessness or despair, and somatic or medical problems. One of the things we know is that people who have experienced trauma are more likely to experience negative health outcomes over their lifetimes. As you can see on your screen, there are a number of things that people may experience. These are compounded for individuals who experience repeated or ongoing traumas. So again, take a look at this slide and the kinds of outcomes people may experience, such as using of drugs, becoming an alcoholic, committing suicide, experiencing depression. Why might this be what happens? This is likely a result of coping to deal with the impact of the trauma on their lives, maybe to numb feelings of pain or to forget what happened. These negative outcomes are put into stark relief while helping someone to heal from trauma, including sexual abuse, are critical, with the hope of curtailing these long-term outcomes. As we have just seen, a traumatic event does not just leave a memory to be recalled. It can have serious long-term impacts on our physical or mental health. Furthermore, the impact of a traumatic event leads to actual changes in the brain. Let me give you an example. Did anyone on the webinar learn to drive with a stick shift car? I did. And this is an example of establishing a new neural network. It's a habit. For sexual assault survivors, these new neural networks or habits can form after one traumatic event, and it can take years to unlearn. These new habits are involuntary and automatic. Survivors do not think about them. They become coping mechanisms for dealing with similar trauma in the future. Have you ever observed someone that is always hyper alert, jumpy, maybe overreacting, irritable, or hypervigilant? These are likely trauma responses, reactions that were started and set in place during a traumatic event. They do not go away because the threat is over. It is very common for survivors to scan their environment trying to assess for safety or threats. Survivors are often perplexed and disturbed, feeling like they've changed in some essential way and may never feel their version of normal again. It's just the brain doing what the brain does. Learning about the brain and how it responds to trauma is interesting as well as complex. We will spend the next few slides explaining the areas of the brain impacted by trauma and how these areas work with one another during a traumatic event. The brain has three major parts. The survival portion of the brain, represented by the lizard on the screen. It is a fast-acting and responds to immediate threats. It is housed deep within the brain and is really the place where our instincts to protect ourselves from threats are managed. The amygdala is part of this area of your brain that is about the size of an almond. It helps to manage emotions and controls how we respond to threats. The limbic system is also quick to react and controls emotion. It has a dual function. It controls how a person responds to danger and processes short-term memory, but can't do both at once. So when trauma occurs, systems not crucial to survivor are switched off. Under normal circumstances, the hippocampus processes short-term memory. But under trauma, the hippocampus changes from a memory processor to a control center, pumping cortisol, which reduces pain so you can focus on survival. Because the limbic system has a dual function, neither one shuts down entirely. It just means that short-term memories are not stored as efficiently as normal, and instead, the trauma memories are stored as feelings and sensations. Last but not least is the cerebral cortex. This is the front part of your brain over your forehead. It is the logical part of your brain that under normal circumstances keeps order and control. So let's take a look at what happens to your brain during a normal non-traumatic event. Under normal circumstances, the cerebral cortex plays a key role in memory, attention, perceptual awareness, thought, language, and consciousness. Emotional stimuli pass through the cerebral cortex of the brain and results in an emotional response. Now let's complicate matters with a traumatic event. Everyone has probably heard of fight, flight, or freeze. These are the automatic, involuntary responses that occur when signaled by the limbic system when danger is identified. Fight and flee are self-explanatory. They are a body's reaction to get away from the threat, either by fleeing or fighting to escape. There are two responses that are commonly described as freeze. The first, the rabbit on your screen, is more like a pause. This momentary freezing, or deer in the headlights, is preparing for action. This is distinct from tonic immobility, or what a possum does. Remember, these are automatic and involuntary. The survivor does not choose their response. I want to tell you a short story about a recent experience I had with a possum. My dog was in the backyard and I realized she was playing with something. When I went to look, it was a baby possum. It was about the size of the baby possum you see on your screen. This was not a picture that I took. While seemingly unharmed, the possum appeared dead, complete with its tongue sticking slightly out from its mouth. I pulled the dog away and we kept an eye on the possum to find out if it was dead or alive. Sure enough, after about 10 to 15 minutes, it was gone. It had sensed my dog as a danger, froze with tonic immobility, playing dead, and stayed that way until its brain sensed the threat was gone before fleeing. How would you react in a dangerous situation? When asked, most people say that they would fight or flee. But what we know is that over 62% of survivors of sexual abuse don't fight or freeze or flee. Instead, they freeze, reacting like the rabbit or the possum. Now that we know that we have automatic, uncontrolled responses to a threat or traumatic event, let's look at what is happening in the brain and how it differs from a normal event. When trauma is experienced, the cerebral cortex is unable to manage the threat and causes the brain to skip the normal processing of stimuli. When the threat is more extreme and you feel more in danger, the cerebral cortex disengages, allowing the amygdala to take over. It's almost like the owl just flies away. The limbic system scans the environment to identify and assess for threats, causing you to have the emotional response of flight, fight, or freeze. Once the threat is gone, the cerebral cortex re-engages and begins to process what happened. What do you think this means for a survivor's healing process when they realize that they just froze and didn't try to fight or run away? Survivors commonly experience self-blame and self-judgment about what they could or should have done. It also highlights the importance of not blaming the survivor when we speak with them, rather to be non-judgmental and supportive. Because of the short-circuiting of the normal brain functions during a time of trauma, the memories of the event may not be recalled in a logical manner, and memories might be incomplete. This can cause challenges during an investigation when investigators are trying to collect information about what happened. Investigators used to be trained to get all the details and to dig to get more, pushing survivors to give answers. But we now know that memories are not necessarily clear in the immediate aftermath of the event. With rest, in fact, 2 sleep cycles are recommended, the memories can come back and the pieces come together a bit more. As a result of this knowledge about the brain, investigators are now trained to do an initial interview, but not to push. They then allow the survivor to get 2 sleep cycles before they do a re-interview. Here's another way to think about what happens to these memories. I'm sure you're familiar with the story of Goldilocks. It's about a young girl who happens upon a cottage that belongs to a family of bears. They're not home. She tries out their food, their chairs, and their beds, causing destruction as she goes. The bears come home to find the young girl asleep on Baby Bear's bed. Now imagine you are the investigator in this story, interviewing Baby Bear immediately afterwards about what happened. Here's what he says. As I read this story, think about what details Baby Bear recalls. We'd gone for a walk. It was a really nice day. I remember that the sun was bright, but it wasn't too hot. We went for a walk because we go for walks all the time. The woods are nice to walk in. We just went for a walk like we always do. We've gone for walks before and nothing ever happened. It was dark in the house, and I remember the first place we went was the kitchen. I knew something was wrong when my mom and papa shouted that someone had been eating their porridge. All I can see is my bowl, all empty, all gone. We'd gone for a walk, all three of us. The porridge was too hot, and we came back from our walk to eat our porridge. I kept thinking it wasn't real, but then there she was. In my bed. Wait. That's not what happened next. We saw the porridge, and it was all gone, and then we couldn't go upstairs next because you have to go through the living room to get to the stairs. When we got back from the walk, we went to the kitchen and then the living room, and I kind of blinked out, but I remember Mama and Papa saying something about their chairs, and then Mama yelled, "It's broken!" And I realized it was my chair. I don't remember walking up the stairs, but we must have, because I remember being in the hallway. It smelled stuffy after being outside, and it seemed really long, like it had stretched out since we had left. Someone screamed, "Help!" And I felt something go flying by me, like the breeze, and it ruffled my cloak. We had gone for a walk and it was a nice day, but it was chilly, so Mama made me wear my cloak. There was a scream from somewhere, and it was like my feet were glued to the floor, and I felt a scream in my throat, but it didn't come out. I don't know how much time went by. We left for our walk before breakfast. Though when we came back, excuse me, we went to the kitchen and then the living room. I felt someone rush by me because I felt a breeze, and Mama and Papa were in the bedroom. So, what details about the event did you hear from Baby Bear? What other things caught your attention? Take a minute to write the things that you heard in the chat box. Again, think about the details that Baby Bear shared and put those in the chat box. And after we get a few of those, Gabriella, if you wouldn't mind reading them like before.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you. So what things have we heard, Gabriella, that people have shared?
So it doesn't look like we've gotten too many responses.
Okay.
It was nice outside and not too hot. And then later he said it was cool and he had to wear a coat, and Baby Bear froze. Those are some of our responses.
That's great. Thank you for that, Gabriella. That's right. I mean, Baby Bear talks multiple times about the walk, that was something that he could recall details about. And while he told bits and pieces of the rest of the story, it did seem out of order, at least from the story that I always know of Goldilocks. And again, you know, hearing about the story from Baby Bear's perspective, it is clear how jumbled the memories are and what details are missing. And it can be helpful to explain this process of trauma and memory to survivors. It can help to alleviate stress related to not being able to recall the details. Trauma memories do come back in fits and starts. There might be a lot of memories about feelings and temperatures, maybe even smells. Think about what Baby Bear kept repeating about how the family went for a walk and the temperature outside, like many of you shared in the chat. For investigators working with survivors, instead of asking them to tell you what happened, ask, what did you feel? What did you touch? Smell? Focus on the details that are central to the survivor. These are the central details that are not vulnerable to change over time. It is the peripheral details that are missing, that are often missing. Think back to Baby Bear. There was a lot of missing details that were not specific to what Baby Bear experienced. Our minds do not like these missing details. In fact, the survivor's mind wants to fill in the peripheral details that are missing. The survivor wants to help. If the investigator is asking direct questions, the survivor may not have the memories, but the mind will want to fill in the pieces. This will actually lead to misinformation being inserted to fill the gaps. In the past, if people changed their stories related to the peripheral details, like the time of the incident, this was often seen as lying. A more effective approach is to ask open-ended questions about what the survivor saw, felt, etc. This will give more accurate information to help survivors fill in the pieces as their mind is able. Remember what I said earlier about allowing 2 sleep cycles to occur before the in-depth interview. With rest, the mind can sort the memories and the peripheral details can come back over time. Lisa, I'll hand things over to you.
Thank you, Tara. Now that we have a better understanding of traumatic events, the long-term emotional impact of trauma and what trauma does to our brains, we will turn the discussion about identifying trauma and how we can respond in a trauma-informed way. We know the reactions of the first few people a survivor tells after a sexual abuse have the greatest impact on their healing. JDI receives letters from survivors of sexual abuse and confinement all the time. They share what has happened to them as well as what people have said to them in response to disclosing sexual abuse. Here are some examples of the victim blaming and dismissal that people may face. A family member saying, well, you shouldn't have gotten arrested in the first place. What did you expect? A lawyer saying, I do not know what you expect me to do about that. Just leave it. It will get in the way of your appeal. A corrections officer saying, I suggest you learn to handle your business. And by the way, you can get charged for making false reports. An investigator saying, look, we've already talked to others on the unit and we know you went into the showers willingly. I can't help you if you don't tell me the truth. If we were in person, we would do an exercise with these statements and more, all real statements, to show how isolating it can make someone feel when they are seeking help and getting turned away. I challenge us, whether we are staff working in confinement setting or a rape crisis advocate providing services to an incarcerated survivor, that we will be a place where someone can come and find help and support. Sexual abuse is experienced as the most personal criminal victimization. Self-blame, telling can be re-traumatizing, but much of how it is experienced by the survivor depends on the response. Someone telling is also an opportunity to get information about trauma and healing, about available services, and to develop a better plan to be safer. According to research, sexual assault survivors who reported had higher levels of PTSD than a survivor who did not report at all. This is because of the negative response that they received. We know that this can be mitigated by a supportive and effective response. Many, if not all of you, are in positions to make reporting a different experience. We also know that the reactions of the first few people a survivor tells have the biggest effect on their healing. It is a heavy responsibility to be faced with someone disclosing sexual abuse or displaying signs of trauma and not knowing how to respond. Expanding our worldview to become trauma-informed will help us to be able to respond to survivors of all kinds of trauma, not just sexual abuse. So what do we mean when we say that a program, organization, or system is trauma-informed? Well, simply put, it is a way of responding that fully integrates knowledge about trauma into its policies, procedures, and practices, and seeks to actively resist re-traumatization. It involves weaving an awareness of trauma into your work to better understand the people in your care. It's not about doing extra work. It's about using the lens of trauma with what you are already doing. This quote is from a recent article from American Corrections Today, a publication by the American Correctional Association. It says, as correctional staff, we often see inmates who can be reactionary, impulsive, and extremely angry. We often do not connect the dots and do not see how their current anger issues, institutional violations, and psychological issues are connected to past trauma. Let's look at what being trauma-informed means for a corrections setting. Having staff that are trauma-informed means they can identify signs of trauma and respond with appropriate interventions. We'll review signs of trauma in a moment. It helps staff to balance the safety and security of the facility with the bodily integrity and responsible privacy of the prisoners. Staff responding in a trauma-informed way will help to minimize re-traumatization. This should include, for example, being aware of possible effects of your abrupt approach, voice level, and nonverbal cues upon a prisoner with a trauma history. It is about survivors being treated with dignity and informed about and connected to the process after a disclosure or request for help. It is about advocates gaining an understanding of the correctional setting to be able to adapt their interventions to fit that setting. This approach will impact the culture of this facility by having more effective behavior management, improving facility safety, and for staff, this will result in greater job satisfaction. It will also lead to a reduction in mental health costs, staff turnover, critical incidents, and the use of restrictive housing and restraints. I think we can all agree that benefits of a trauma-informed approach are worth the effort. We've talked a lot about trauma and the short and long-term impacts. This slide summarizes what we discussed and the impacts as a result of trauma. These impacts play out in day-to-day activities in a facility. Let's take a minute to think about what things may cause trauma reaction or response in a confinement setting. You've probably heard statements about something triggering a trauma response. This can occur when something in the environment triggers something in the brain, bringing back a memory of the trauma experience. In a confinement setting, there's a lot of external stimuli, the noise, clanging doors, yelling, other prisoners and inmates, staff instructions, lights, alarms, potential contact with the perpetrator, perpetrator's colleagues or associates, patent strip searches, or even reminders of past trauma. All of these can be multiple triggers causing the body to be triggered and have a trauma response. When someone is incarcerated, there are additional barriers to healing that a survivor may face. When someone is in confinement, they have very little control over their body or their environment, and just a general lack of privacy, which can feel like being back in an abusive environment or remind a survivor of how they felt when they were assaulted. General searches, and especially strip searches, are particularly triggering. Things like restraints can be a trigger, living where they were abused, often with the abuser. Incarcerated folks are also incredibly isolated and can feel alone in their trauma and in the healing process. And because trauma reactions are often so misunderstood, there can be punishments imposed for what are normal reactions. If the assault occurred within detention, there is the fear that there could be retaliation for reporting from the perpetrator and staff. There's also a strong likelihood that the survivor will have to have ongoing contact with the perpetrator and limited access to counseling and care. Let's take a look at some of the signs of trauma that a person may exhibit. We'll separate them into categories of behavioral, emotional, and physical. First, we see on this slide some of the behavioral signs that you might notice in someone experiencing trauma. As I review these, I'd like you to be thinking about times when you may have seen these behaviors from inmates in your custody or care. So some of these can be blowing up when corrected, fighting when criticized or confused, resisting transition or change, very protective of personal space, being reckless or self-destructive, frequently seeking attention, or reverting to younger behaviors. Now let's continue with these emotional and physical signs of trauma. Again, be thinking about the inmates you work with as I read this list to you. Nightmares or sleeping problems, sensitivity to noise or touch, fear of being separated from family or friends, difficulty trusting others, feeling very sad, afraid, angry, mood swings, and unexplained medical problems. Here are some psychological signs of trauma that you may have noticed in your inmates. None of these signs is always associated with trauma or always associated specifically with inmates. However, each of these signs can be adaptations to neurobiological changes associated with trauma. Even one of these signs should be enough to raise the possibility of trauma. Just being aware that what we sometimes call symptoms may be adaptations to underlying trauma that can be helpful. These can change the way we view children. These symptoms can continue into adulthood. So, what do you do when someone has recently experienced a traumatic event or has been triggered by someone or something causing a traumatic response? Let's look specifically at how you can be supportive when someone discloses they have been sexually abused, whether it happened recently in the confinement setting or at some other time in their life. Stop asking questions and listen. Reflect back the feelings you hear and observe. Offer support and validation. Be clear about what you can do to help and what you are required to do. Here are other trauma-informed recommendations. Give control of the situation to the person as much as possible within safety limits. Loss of control is the essence of sexual abuse trauma. Avoid whys. Example being a person asking, "Why did you wait so long to tell?" The response may be, "Never mind, nothing happened." Remember that sexual abuse survivors, because of reactions to trauma, give off all signals most of us think of as someone lying. They might fidget, not give eye contact, seem to be searching for details of the story, agreeing with any leading questions you ask. They might be desperate to get a housing move, seem like they are manipulating. Not saying any of this is direct evidence of sexual abuse, but I'm saying that it is possible evidence of trauma and is certainly not evidence that abuse didn't happen.
Great, thank you, Lisa. In the previous webinar, we provided an overview of PREA with a particular focus on the victim services standards. Let's do a quick refresher on these before turning to what these look like in practice. The specific PREA standards that deal with victim services are listed here. We will primarily focus our discussion on these two standards, 115.21, Evidence Protocol and Forensic Medical Examinations, and 115.53, Inmate Access to Outside Confidential Support Services. I encourage you to go to the PREA standards to read them completely, but for now, we will look at what basic compliance with these two standards entails. Let's review the expectations of advocates in standards 115.21. Concerning the forensic medical examinations, a facility must provide a victim advocate to accompany victims as requested through the forensic exam process and investigatory interviews, and provide emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. Of course, survivors do not have to accept these services, but facilities must make them available. So what might this look like? Facilities should explain the kinds of services available when the inmate first comes to the facility. This could be during the initial or comprehensive inmate education or both. Information about the advocacy accompaniment should also be included in the inmate handbook. But it is not enough to tell inmates when they first get to the facility that should anything happen, that they can have an advocate to support them. In a time of crisis, inmates are not going to remember to ask for an advocate. They should be told that an advocate is available to them. It is then the survivor's choice whether or not to allow an advocate to provide them with these services. A survivor should never be forced to accept the services of an advocate. However, it is possible that hearing about an advocate from someone from the facility where the sexual abuse occurred may not be well received. Another option is to have the advocate available at the hospital and have them talk with the survivor about the services they provide, allowing the survivor to choose whether or not to accept the services. These services extend not to just the forensic medical exam, but as I mentioned, also to the investigatory interviews and ongoing emotional support, crisis intervention, information, and referrals. The advocate never forces a survivor to do anything, but provides them with information to allow them to make an informed decision. Let's review what is needed to comply with Standard 11553. Agencies must provide access to outside victim advocates for emotional support services, provided either by telephone or mail or both. If folks can use the raise your hand option, which I think is available to you today, indicate if your agency or facility provides access through either of these approaches, either by telephone or both, that you provide services to incarcerated survivors. If people can raise their hand to show, is that an option for them, Gabriella?
Yeah, everybody has the option to
Great.
raise their hands. It will show up in our participants box.
Great. Are we seeing anyone indicating those, Gabriella?
Yes, we have 2 participants who have raised their hands indicating that.
Okay, great, thank you. So I can imagine though that for many of you, before COVID-19, if you were providing in-person services in some way, I'm guessing that this has changed and you've had to pivot to find ways to provide services in other ways. I suspect this will be the new normal for some time to come. Keep in mind that while in-person one-on-one services or groups, in-person groups are tremendously helpful, you are still serving survivors with mail, phone, and even email services if available. Also keep in mind that these services are to be made available to all inmates who have experienced sexual abuse, no matter when it happened in their lives. This includes people who were sexually abused as children or as adults in the community. It is not limited to sexual abuse someone experiences in confinement. It is quite possible that someone has never had the opportunity to talk with someone, and this is the first chance they are able to tell someone about this experience and get support and healing. Services are to be provided in as confidential a manner as possible. This is a point where facilities and advocacy organizations need to talk and make sure that both parties are in agreement about what confidential a manner as possible means. It is also critical that inmates be told the limits to confidentiality at the initiation of services. In the next webinar next week, we will review the reporting requirements set forth by the PREA standards and how they are commonly confused with this standard about access to confidential support services. We will also talk in detail about confidentiality and what that looks like to providing services for incarcerated survivors. An additional requirement of this standard is reasonable communication between inmates and these support services. So what does this look like? Here are a few examples. If prisoners can use the phone to access services, this means that they can use any phone used for any other purpose to access support services. Only having one phone in a unit, only having a phone in mental health or the medical office, or having to request to use a phone to make a call are all barriers to reasonable communication. This includes the ability of people in segregated housing accessing services. If communications occur via letters, it is making sure that there are no limits to the length of the letters they send or receive from advocates. The standard also focuses on the creation of an MOU or Memorandum of Understanding or attempts to enter into such an agreement. Unfortunately, sometimes when there is an agreement, the details have not been spelled out in enough detail, which can lead to confusion about what is provided, by whom, and when. To help work out these kinks, or at least to raise your awareness about these potential pitfalls, the last webinar in this series, so towards the end of July, we'll talk about the MOU and guidance on creating an MOU, how to revise it, and also details for consideration. There are a number of things that can support healing from trauma for an incarcerated survivor. As staff working in a prison or jail, you have the ability to support survivors in their healing in a number of ways. Please know that the goal is not to make corrections staff counselors, rather to go about your work understanding trauma and how the ways with which you interact with prisoners will impact their healing process. Ways that corrections staff can support survivors to heal from trauma include consistency and structure, the ability to have control in small ways, separation from abusers, and contact with family and a support system. Non-judgmental support from staff and mental health providers, connecting them with confidential crisis support from outside providers, and providing information about the process and status of the PREA investigation and follow-up. Are there any of these that are unrealistic in a confinement setting? If we have anyone from a corrections setting joining us today, if you could put into the chat box any of these that are unrealistic in your facility, that would be helpful for us to explore. Have we had anyone add anything to the chat box, Gabriella? I don't know how many, we did not ask at the beginning how many folks are from corrections joining us today.
Yeah, it doesn't look like anybody has typed anything into the chat box.
Okay.
You have a question. What if the inmates do not have money to contact family and support?
Oh, that's a great question. And I'd love to hear Lisa's thought about this as well. So I'm just going to back up a slide because I think that was on here about contacting family and support system. So first of all, just I'll pick up on sort of the confidential support piece of things. Part of having that reasonable communication should ensure that inmates don't have to pay like they would with other phone calls to contact those outside confidential support services. Same with facilities that may use like a kiosk and inmates can send emails, or with sending a letter that they have access to the supplies they need to send a letter. So that shouldn't be a barrier to accessing those confidential support services. I think it does get a little bit trickier with contacting family and support systems. Because like inmates typically have to have money on their inmate accounts in order to contact people, whether by phone or letters or that sort of thing. So I think that if we're looking at this from a trauma-informed approach, it's about recognizing when there are individuals who are healing from trauma and might need some additional supports. It might mean that, the PREA coordinator at the facility, offers to, makes arrangements for that person to have a visitor, their family come and visit, or to make a phone call to family to support them, or maybe providing materials so that they can write a letter. Or it could be, coordinating with, mental health or medical to help have access to, to make a phone call, that sort of thing. Lisa, what additional thoughts do you have to that question?
Well, this can be particularly tricky depending on how the local jail or facility offers visitation. I do know that our NCDPS requires a visitation law. You have to apply for it, and it's only certain days, and you have to travel to the location. Most jails in North Carolina allow for video visitation, and the free visits that are offered to inmates typically occur on site at the jail. So that individual would still have to travel or find a way to travel. So it's definitely something that, as an advocate, I would strongly recommend speaking with your prison or jail and talking to them about how indigent inmates have access to letter writing or phone calls and support without outing themselves as being a survivor. So that's something that's very important, and it may be something that you can help support that local facility and educate them in the ways of a trauma-informed approach, and to help this individual, like we mentioned earlier, having this trauma-informed approach will help with the overall safety and security of the facility. So it's definitely something that in North Carolina we'll see on a case-by-case basis as well, to see what the specifics are.
Great, thank you for that, Lisa. Something else when you were talking, Lisa, that it dawned on me I should make a comment about is that aside from this issue of sexual abuse and healing from trauma, again, just a recognition of with the global pandemic that every jurisdiction that I know of has stopped allowing visitors to come into a facility. So that is definitely having an impact on individuals. Many corrections facilities for their phone services have a contract with a major provider. And I have heard that these providers are offering, I think it's like 2 free phone calls a week to inmates, just to help, kind of bridge that, their inability to actually have visitors come support them in person. So to help, maintain those contacts, even if they don't have money to make those phone calls. So certainly it's not a replacement for in-person visits, and, even 2 calls a week. If it's it may be 2 calls a month, I don't recall. But at least it's something that is being offered to people. Lisa, any other thoughts about that?
No, I just know that specifically with North Carolina jail standards, do define indigent inmates. There are so many days that an individual has to have a certain amount or less in their account. And so again, the advocates, it's really helpful to make sure what your jail or prison, what their policies and procedures are.
Great, thank you, Lisa. For victim advocates, we're gonna shift gears, or we're gonna talk a little bit more about coping skills in detention. As advocates, your role is to support survivors in healing by providing them information about the steps in the investigation process, and to work with them to help identify healthy coping skills and creating a safety plan. When we're thinking about safety planning and coping skills in detention, it has to look very different than probably the options you're giving people in the community that you're working with. So for example, in the community, a safety plan for a survivor would include avoiding the perpetrator, but this may not be possible in a detention setting, since the incarcerated survivor has little to no control over their own movement within the facility. And so take a minute and just think about the kinds of coping skills that you suggest to survivors in the community. And give, you don't have to have all the answers right now, but just start giving thought to, how can you alter these to work with survivors in confinement? How can things like exercising and reading, those can be good things to suggest to survivors, since they don't require additional materials and can be done in most environments. Exercising may not always be possible, especially, I think about with COVID-19, a lot of facilities are limiting out of cell time. So that may not be possible, kind of outdoor activities. Other ideas could be progressive muscle relaxation techniques, journaling, but again, this has to be up to the survivor if they think it's safe, and if they have access to writing materials and they aren't concerned about the journal, potentially being read by others. And also practicing mindfulness or meditation and providing guidance on how to do those activities. They may be new, all of these ideas might be new for people, so you'll need to be prepared to talk with them about how how to do those. The other thing is, if you joined us on our webinar last week, the person from Mecklenburg County Jail, she shared about taking a tour of the facility. And I would just like to stress that again, because again, thinking about the kinds of coping skills you can offer to people will be dependent on what the setting looks like. And so if you are aware of the setting, that will certainly help in your conversations with that survivor. I'd now like to share with you a case study about a woman named Alice that brings together many of the key elements and the essence of today's webinar. This case study was published in the Behavioral Health Resource Guide in 2017 by the Correctional Behavioral Health Working Group, which is of the Coalition of Correctional Health Authorities, an entity of the American Correctional Association. I do want to note that there is some graphic descriptions and graphic content. So if that's upsetting to people, I would just take a couple of minutes and join us and then rejoin us later. So I'm going to call this Alice a case study. Alice is a 25-year-old woman who has a significant history of self-injurious behavior, including vertical cuts to her wrist, banging her head against windows until bloodied, refusing to take medication, and attacking individuals she perceived as threatening. She had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and had been prescribed Risperdal. In an act of ultimate noncompliance, she began to smear her body with feces before engaging in an attack against staff or self-injurious behavior. Alice's first interactions with mental health staff were through the bars of a cell in which she remained locked 23 hours a day due to her propensity for violence. However, in this correctional facility, a new unit was opened that had a trauma-informed focus. Alice was referred to the unit mostly because no one knew what to do with her, not because she was perceived as needing to be in a therapeutic program. However, when staff approached her and asked whether she'd be willing to talk about her experiences in jail, Alice agreed. She agreed to move to the therapeutic unit after being informed of the rules and expectations of living in the housing area. Interestingly, she asked over and over again if the unit was going to be safe because she was tired of being abused by officers. Alice transitioned to the new unit, participated in all therapeutic activities, and began to demonstrate socially appropriate behavior. In therapy, she disclosed that as a child, her drug-addicted mother had sold her to men for drugs. She had learned that if she was bloody or covered in feces, people were less likely to rape her, or if she was being raped, it would stop more quickly. Violence had become her strategy to cope with conflict and escape danger. Through working with Alice, it was discovered that when officers approached her quickly and/or using a loud and intense tone of voice, this triggered a trauma response in which Alice felt a need to flight or freeze or fight. It was realized that the same trigger existed when going to court and when being given directives associated with movements throughout the facility. It was also determined that strip searches were a highly vulnerable time for Alice. After 1 month on the unit, Alice's diagnosis was changed to PTSD. She was taken off the antipsychotic medication and began treatment for trauma and depression. A treatment plan was created that educated officers on how to have appropriate and safe interactions with Alice, taking her trauma history into consideration. Alice blossomed when she began to participate in art therapy, and she realized that artistic expression helped control her moods, and that she was a very talented artist and could use that talent to make money when she was released. Using a trauma-informed approach helped Alice realize her true potential and allowed her to finish her time in a way that was safe and healthy. We started this webinar with a note about self-care, knowing that this webinar would include information and details about sexual abuse. In a webinar focused on trauma, we would be remiss if we didn't mention the importance of self-care as well for those of us in this work. As Dr. Rachel Raymond says, quote, "The expectation that we can be immersed in suffering and loss daily and not be touched by it is as unrealistic as expecting to be able to walk through water without getting wet," end quote. Being witness to or hearing or learning about another person's trauma experiences can lead to vicarious trauma, whether you feel it or not. And this is true for victim advocates as well as for corrections staff. I'm going to read the description of vicarious trauma from the Office for Victims of Crime. Quote, vicarious trauma is an occupational challenge for people working and volunteering in the fields of victim services, law enforcement, emergency medical services, fire services, and other allied professions due to their continuous exposure to victims of trauma and violence. And while individuals respond to vicarious trauma in a number of ways, a change in their worldviews is considered inevitable, end quote. Thinking about this description, how has working in this occupation with the ongoing exposure, and when I say occupation, I mean as a victim advocate or as a corrections professional, how has your occupation and your ongoing exposure to vicarious trauma possibly changed your worldview? Think about this for a moment as I move on to the next slide. I will be the first to admit that I internalize vicarious trauma and store it in some deep, dark recess of my mind. Unfortunately, if I do not find ways to release the stress it causes me, I find myself irritable, unable to concentrate, and antsy. There's a book called Trauma Stewardship in which the author talks about the signs of vicarious trauma. I'm going to go through these, and I'd like you to be thinking about whether you've personally experienced or been experiencing any of these, or whether you can think of anyone of your work colleagues that you've noticed with some of these signs. So one sign is tending to think in black and white, where things are either good or bad, right or wrong. There is no in between, or you struggle to work within shades of gray. You find yourself comparing your own trauma experiences to someone else's as not really all that bad. This takes away from the value of the trauma that you've endured. You've been avoiding your feelings or not allowing yourself the time and space to process. You may not even be noticing your feelings. You've become numb to others' traumatic situations and developed an inability to empathize. Additional signs of vicarious trauma may include feeling guilt, fear, or cynicism, experiencing an increase in physical ailments such as illness, pain, or fatigue, or having one or more addictions, anything in excess, including food, drugs and alcohol, shopping, gaming, exercise, social media, the internet, porn. It is important not only to recognize vicarious trauma, but also to do something about it. These can include not ignoring the signs, asking for help when needed, establishing work and personal life balance, which I think we all can agree is a difficult thing to do from time to time, developing healthy practices in relationships with food, exercise, sleep, connecting with loved ones, and hobbies, and to take advantage of workplace benefits such as time off and employee assistance programs. And I know the American Correctional Association has a wellness committee and has recently received a federal grant to develop resources on staff wellness with the intent that they be shared with corrections professionals across the nation. And as we move into the Q&A portion of the webinar, I want to share with you PREA playing cards that JDI developed and which are being used by inmates across the country. They are just one example of tools that you can use to promote positive institutional culture and a trauma-informed approach. Each card has a message on it, such as, you can always ask for help if someone threatens you or makes you feel uncomfortable, or you deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. Not only do these cards help reinforce good messages from the administration, they are also educational. Gabriella, let me turn things back to you and see what questions we have from participants.
So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A, and we will answer anything that comes to your mind. So I'll give a couple minutes for anybody to type out their questions. Please post the name of the book. So it was Trauma Stewardship, which if you are one of our members, you can actually go to our NC CASA library and we will send you the book so that you can read it and return it.
Great, that's wonderful to know that resource is available.
Yeah, let me go ahead and go find the link for this. And then Courtney, while I look for the link, if you could read the chat box. I suck at multitasking.
Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So someone mentioning it changed me, vicarious trauma changed me by taking away my smile and losing trust in some areas. It's vicarious trauma as an ongoing and daily reality in local programs. Let's see. And then Lisa mentioned if we already work with law enforcement in the community and they do not use a trauma-informed approach, how can we expect a jail or prison to use one?
Sure. And maybe Lisa, do you have some thoughts about that, about encouraging a trauma-informed approach?
Well, I do know NC CASA already supports communities to use a local SART team so that they could work with all of those individuals responding to sexual abuse and sexual assault. And I think it's really important that, especially if your law enforcement isn't quite there already, while you're trying to create your relationship with your local jail or prison, that you also
Oh, Lisa, are you still there?
oops, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
That you also, sorry, I'm not sure when I cut off, but it's important that you include your jails and prisons in your local community work and show them what it means to have a trauma-informed approach and how important that is in the healing of the survivor and how that can really impact, you know, recidivism and things of that nature.
Great. And another thing I see here in the chat that was placed was just about the role that mental health plays in making housing and placement decisions. So, you know, this is, there are standards, PREA standards related to how housing and placement decisions are made. And I think while it is outside of the victim services standard, I think it's a great point to raise and that we can quickly review that standard. When individuals come to a confinement facility, whether it's their first time coming to the jail or even if they're moving between facilities within the Department of Corrections, they are to be screened. And the screening involves asking questions about, that will make a determination about their risk of sexual victimization or their risk of sexual perpetration. Some of those questions include asking if they've been previously sexually abused. And if individuals disclose that they have had previous sexual abuse, they are, or previous sexual perpetration, they are to receive a referral to mental health within 14 days. And so, you know, as victim advocates, sorry, before I talk about victim advocates, so what they do, what facilities do is they take all the information from all the questions and they use those to make informed decisions about people's housing, bed, placement, program, work, and education placements. It's not to prohibit anyone from, you know, participating in anything or any work assignment or where their bed location is, but it's to make sure that if there are individuals who are at an increased risk for victimization, that they are kept safe from anyone who may be, who may be at higher risk for perpetrating sexual abuse. And as victim advocates, I would encourage, you know, as you're building relationships with facilities, to also reach and try to build relationships, just not with the security side of the house, but also with the medical and mental health. Because I think what we see over and over again is that the mental health caseloads are just overwhelming for people working in corrections. But if they know that they can turn to you all as advocates to refer individuals who may be looking to heal or who may be have disclosed previous sexual abuse, that can be a tremendous benefit and a great working collaboration with those individuals in a confinement setting. Are there any other questions that have come through?
No, it doesn't look like we've had any other questions.
Okay. Great. Well, I know there are some final slides. I just wanted to turn to Lisa and see if there was anything else you wanted to add, Lisa, before we have Gabriella close things out for us.
No, I think that pretty much covers it all. Thank you, Tara.
Sure. Great. Okay, Gabriella, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, so these are the resources that you may find useful in working with incarcerated survivors of sexual abuse. Next slide. Hope Behind Bars is a guide for advocates working with incarcerated survivors, and you can find it at that link below. And we will also be putting this webinar on our website later and also on our YouTube channel. So feel free to go back and look at the resources that are listed in here by also viewing those. Next slide. Thank you for joining us today. Please be in touch with NC CASA or GDI with questions you have about this topic, any of the topics in the series, or anything PREA related. Here are NC CASA contacts: Courtney Dunkerton, Robin Colbert, and their email. We hope you will join us next Tuesday when we have a webinar on confidentiality in the PREA reporting standards. Also, we are sending out webinar certificates for every single webinar that you attend. So you will receive that at the end of the month, and you will have a week to register before receiving the certificate for attending. So thank you all so much for coming out and being here with us as we go over PREA, and we really hope to see you next Tuesday. All right, and that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and end the session. Thank you so much.